Welcome to the Watchdog with me, Low-Key, on Mint Press. As you know, each week we are going against the grain and covering stories which are routinely ignored by the mainstream media. For that reason, we really hope that you can support us on Patreon if you can, or just support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing on this channel. Today, we are here to talk about the momentous boycott of the Sydney Festival, organized by Palestinians and others in Australia. Firstly, we are joined by Jennine, who is a former newsroom journalist who has worked at ABC and News Corp Australia. We have an interesting story about how she was essentially pushed out of that organization by those who are working in some way for the interests of the Israeli state. We are also joined by Sara Saleh, who is the daughter of people that came from Palestine, from Egypt, from Lebanon, and today she is living on Gadigal land. What is known as Australia, of course, has the history of over 500 nations of indigenous people who were genocided. And these people who are working for Palestinian rights in Australia clearly have a recognition of that relationship and that bond between indigenous people. Sara is the co-editor of the 2019 anthology, Arab, Australian, Other Stories on Race and Identity. It is great to be joined by these two great activists and organizers who are working very, very hard as we speak to push this campaign for BDS against the Sydney Festival, because it has received sponsorship from the Israeli embassy in Australia. Now, just to start with, it would be great, Jennine, to talk to you about your experience in mainstream media and how those who lobby for the Israeli state sought to push you out of your position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were so many incidents and events that took place that ultimately led me to leaving newsrooms in Australia. But I started out quite young as a journalist. I was still in my first year of university, and I joined the local papers. So here in Australia, News Corp has basically a monopoly on the local newspapers here. And 2 or so years into that, I was offered a role at the national broadsheet, The Australian. It's the only national broadsheet. Being a young journalist who, entered journalism and also ended up dropping my law degree in service of journalism, because I was so intent on sharing and telling stories that don't get told, and thinking, I suppose naively, that I could do that within these systems or these like mainstream outlets. I took that job to my regret, but also in a way I am glad that I worked there and had the experiences that I had with Zionist lobby groups in Australia, because it gave me very close insight into what takes place, because we know of these things. It's sort of a universally known thing that Palestine is censored in newsrooms, but seeing it up close and being targeted really opened my eyes to it. So I guess I mean, there are so many instances, and the one that probably stands out to me the most, and which was covered in John Lyons, who's now currently the head of investigations at the ABC, but he was a Middle East correspondent based in Jerusalem during my time, or before my time, but he was at the Australian. And so I was 21. It was towards the end of the first year I was at the Australian, and there were so many incidents that had happened in the lead up to that, which I can go into further detail. But I was at a work barbecue, and my editor at the time, I was chatting to him, and I said, it's really weird. Like this week, I had two people who work at the Israeli Foreign Ministry like follow me on Twitter just suddenly. It was like one after the other. And he was like, oh yeah, he goes, yeah, like now that you mentioned that, they were actually here and they saw us this week. They had a meeting with us, and he told me that they were there, and they asked him and Chris Mitchell, the other editor, why have you hired a Palestinian? So these are two foreign diplomats, and I use the term diplomats loosely when it comes to the Israeli apartheid regime, pressuring these editors who had to back me in this meeting room with them, asking them why they had a Palestinian on staff. It was a threat to them. And it was because I had pitched and really stood by a couple of articles. It was tough to push articles to get them published that were related to Palestine in a domestic sense as well, like connecting Palestine to the local community here. And they were valid stories. They were newsworthy, and I also extremely terminally online and very unapologetic about my my Palestinian identity and my family who are refugees, exiled because of the Nakba, because of Zionist militias that expelled them. So that essentially was, I guess, one of the bigger like oh shit sort of moments where you have people who directly work for the state of Israel being here in this continent, making the time to go see the editors of the only national broadsheet, the only national newspaper in Australia, to talk about a 21-year-old Palestinian journalist.
Your experience is covered by John Lyons in his book, Dateline Jerusalem, Journalism's Toughest Assignment. But from what I understand, News Corps has a charitable wing, it's foundation, News Corps Foundation, which was included in the annual report of the Jerusalem Foundation. This is an organization which builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. And News Corps Foundation has been involved in funding this organization. We also know that Rupert Murdoch is on the board of a gas and oil company, which has been given a massive contract in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights of Syria. He's on that board alongside Richard Woolsey, formerly of the CIA, and Dick Cheney, if my memory serves me correctly. So there are clear links, on a very macro and high level between News Corps and Rupert Murdoch, obviously, and the state of Israel. But as far as I understand, your experience at the Australian and your kind of awareness of this proximity to the state of Israel started when you identified a story which had been fed to a journalist by this organization, UN Watch. If you can tell us about this situation, and then we will discuss a little bit more about UN Watch.
Absolutely. So this actually took place during my first week that I joined. So there was one reporter who at the time was the media reporter at the Australian. Her name is Sherry Markson, who introduced herself to me on the first day. And then the second day, she came up to me again and sort of pulled up a seat and once again introduced herself. But this time, and I'm giving this for context, right? This is, she was wearing a Star of David necklace and she was like playing with it. And the sense that I got at that time was that she was trying to, as though I was a vampire and she was holding up garlic, like, as though I would sort of melt and scream in fear or react. It was an attempt to be provocative, which I found like ridiculous, honestly. But so she said to me during that conversation that she'd asked me if I spoke Arabic, and if I could read Arabic. And being there, it's my first week, and I honestly I had no idea who she was. Like, I wasn't privy to a lot of things at that time, in terms of those who work there. A lot of nameless, sort of faceless people, if I'm being honest, and I didn't read it. So advice to anyone who wants to work at any media outlet, like, first read the articles before taking the job, just FYI. But yeah, so I said to her, yeah, I do. And, it was my first week, and I just didn't want to like step on anyone's toes. In my mind, I'm thinking like, I'm not here to be a translator. But she told me that she had a story, and it required some translating of Arabic. So I was like, sure, send it over to me. I'll translate it for you. So I translated it, and as I was translating it, I realized it was about the Saudi activist Raif Badawi, who has been imprisoned for basically criticizing Saudi Arabia and was deemed sort of a heretic, and his wife, who now currently lives in Canada with their children, is campaigning for his release. So in my mind, I was like, well, this is, it's bringing attention to the story, rightfully so. A man is in prison for expressing his views. And I finished up, and I actually walked up to her desk, where she was sitting, to just let her know that I had emailed it over. And if there was anything else that she needed, so I could sort of get back to settling in. And she had her desktop, her emails open. And this was as I was approaching, and I sort of stood there, and I don't think she realized. So she turned around, and I was looking at the desktop, and it was an email thread with Hilal Noor from UN Watch and Vic Al-Hadaf from the Jewish Board of Deputies, who is a lobbyist. And my name was there. I couldn't see the specifics, but I did see my name, and I was really taken aback. And I was just I recall Vic Al-Hadaf, actually, I think the 2 years before that, he knows me. He'd known me at a university event where someone was speaking on Palestine. He was sitting in front of me, and he was discreetly recording the speakers. And I'm trying to recall exactly what happened, but basically he asked a question, and it was a sort of but Hamas kind of question. And me sitting behind him, I just I sniggered. I was and he turned around, and he was like, oh, terrorist, you're a terrorist. And so Vic had known me, and I'd been also quite vocal on Twitter and involved in some organizing before that. So I saw this email chain between her, Vic Al-Hadaf, and Hilal Noor, and my name was in the email. And it turned out again, that the story was about Raif Badawi. And I had translated it. I had translated that copy that she wanted me to translate from Arabic to English. And, I walked away, this being my third or fourth day, just feeling a bit weirded out, of course. Just wasn't able to sort of process what was happening. It was very strange. It was very alien. I was thinking, this is what happens in newsrooms. So I was confronted by it in the very first week. And then the next day, the paper had come out, because this is the National Broadsheet being a daily paper. And there was a story, and I think it was maybe like page 1, 2, 3, towards the beginning, about Raif Badawi. But Raif Badawi and this case was peripheral. Okay, it was about how the state of Israel is, like exceptional in the terms of how it's targeted, and how nobody gives poor Israel a break. And I was horrified. I was horrified that it was very intentional to have me translate this copy. They have translators. They have a lot of money at the Australian. This was my first week there. They would have, worked on stories where they'd have to translate things. But the fact is, Shari Markson came to me, used me, knowing full well that I'm Palestinian and where I stand, to essentially work on a story that was defending and whitewashing Israeli apartheid. So that, in instances like that happened so often. And, sometimes I think to myself, I sort of have a conversation to myself. I think, like, why didn't I leave earlier, experiencing these things? Why didn't I just leave? And the reason truly is that, I was miserable, but I wanted to leave on my own terms. I did not want to be bullied out by the Zionist lobby groups. I did not want them to have that win, because that is what they were angling for. They didn't want me there. And they wanted to make me as uncomfortable as possible. And they had, quote unquote journalists on the inside working in their service, creating dossiers of my tweets, complaining to the editors, going to HR. If I had retweeted something about Gaza, calling me, saying I'm an activist. I'm not a journalist. And they'd openly have conversations, Shari, for example, and a couple of the other journalists as well. I remember her saying that she had gone to an IDF fundraiser the night before with her fiance. And she sits right next to me and just like really openly talking about it. And it was just such a hostile environment. But I refused, I refused, despite staying in that space. There was no way that I was going to let them win, even if that meant being miserable. But I knew I had to kind of do my own thing in the way that I could within.
Yeah, I mean, well, if we deconstruct what exactly happened, when we look at the case of Vic Al-Hedaf, who is very well connected within Australian media and has worked in it for many years, and for 17 years was the CEO of the Board of Deputies, the British partner of the Board of Deputies has in its own trustees' annual report acknowledged that it has a strong working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthened links with the IDF. And so you imagine the Australian counterpart would have a similar type of relationship. When you look at an organization like UN Watch, who were in that email chain, it was founded by Maurice Abraham, who was the former permanent US representative to the UN in Geneva. But at the time of its establishment in 1993, was also the honorary president of the American Jewish Committee. Now, this is an organization that also works closely with the Israeli embassy. And at that time, UN Watch was a joint project of the AJC and the World Jewish Congress. Let's not forget that the World Jewish Congress, on its own website, says it's committed to supporting Israel and defending it against delegitimization in every sphere. That's a direct verbatim quote. And when you look at the way that UN Watch functions, it even puts on its own mission statement that, quote unquote, part of our work is to combat anti-Israel bias within the UN system, which we believe hampers its ability to effectively respond to urgent human rights situations around the world. UN Watch has also lobbied against UN figures for this supposed anti-Israel bias, from Jean Ziegler to Peter Hansen to Mary Robinson. And in fact, Kofi Annan at one point said to Peter Hansen, "I do not have the capital with the Americans, the political capital, to keep you here." And eventually Peter Hansen was pushed out of the United Nations. When you look at these figures that were involved in its founding, for instance, the chairman of UN Watch was Alfred H. Moses, who is on the board of trustees for the Institute for National Security Studies, which is an Israeli intelligence think tank. So what we're talking about is an organization which struggles to disguise its role as a proxy of the Israeli state. But when you look at its initial founding, Edgar Bronfman, the president of the World Jewish Congress, again, which, as I said, it's a constitutionally Zionist organization, the Bronfman family were essential in the building of the Birthright program. So if we deconstruct it all, you have people who are pretty clear when we look at the Board of Deputies side of things, the American Jewish Committee side of things, that they work with the Israeli government, involved really in keeping tabs on you. You have someone like Sherry Markson within this media organization making a dossier of your tweets and your public pronouncements and seeking to use them to discredit you. And essentially, this is the kind of thing which is playing out in many different countries of strategic importance, from Britain to the United States to Australia. Carefully organized networks who work on pushing out and silencing who work on pushing out and silencing critical voices of Zionism, but also people, and I wonder about this translation, whether it was, we can't rule out the possibility that it was to check your proficiency in the Arabic language. This is a small micro part of a massive story about how this Zionist Israeli apartheid is essentially being extended into the newsrooms of Australia and extended into the political system of Britain, as we have seen with the last few years and the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and supporters. Thousands of supporters of his have been silenced and pushed out of that political party, the Labour Party. But now, if we move on to the topic of the day, which of course is closely related to what we are talking about, it is this momentous boycott of the Sydney Festival, which you have both been involved in. And the website Music Feed has described it as a mass as a mass exodus of artists from the 2022 roster of Sydney Festival. So, Sara, if you could just break down for us, what is the Sydney Festival and why have you organized this boycott?
So Sydney Festival is one of Australia's most long-standing, iconic annual cultural celebrations. It has spans creatives and comedians and performers and artists across the country, but obviously the focus being Sydney and grassroots local artists, but also international artists as well. So this year, Michaela Cole, for example, being one of them. So a really important landmark event for us as artists here in the scene in the Australian colony. And what happened is this year, the embassy, the festival partnered up. So basically took money, 20,000 Australian dollars from the Israeli embassy in Canberra. And this sponsorship is being used to support a Sydney dance company production of Decadence, which is, of course, an Israeli production. So Decadence, for those that aren't familiar, is a dance show, and it's essentially run by an Israeli choreographer, Ohad Naharin. And the issue here is, of course, the fact that it is being funded by the Israeli embassy, so the state of Israel. So when artists in Western Sydney predominantly, but across the board, found out that this was the case and that the sponsorship, so is the Israeli embassy had been made a star partner with its logo splashed on the front page, ironically near an acknowledgement of country or just shortly after, we artists were very concerned, and we decided to approach the festival and request that they drop the partnership. In response to our request, the festival claimed to be non-political. And I think this is really where things got I think things took a real turn real quick, because initially we'd approached the festival in good faith to have this conversation, to explain that this partnership is essentially making them complicit in art washing Israel's atrocities. It's a well-known instrument of soft power, let's call it. And we really held their hand through it. We met members of the board. We had several conversations. We had a widely respected artist called Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmed, who is the director of a Western Sydney literacy-based movement, Sweatshop, who was actually invited to be on the board, saw that partnership and then went, hold it, pumped the brakes and said, we need to have this conversation before I can actually join the board, because this is really harmful to our communities. So we did approach them in good faith. We had these conversations, and what they did was actually double down and say to us, well, we can't really take a side. This is, we are a non-political festival. And I think for any, quite frankly, for anyone, any organization, specifically an arts one, to say that they are non-political is really disingenuous when we are creating and existing and making art on stolen land. And the very act of making art is political. Being here in this Australian colony is political. And I think that the fact that Sydney Festival itself has a very explicit commitment to, values, to being anti-colonial, to being inclusive, to acknowledging the fact that, they are on stolen land and wanting to maintain that, expressing solidarity with First Nations communities. It's quite even more egregious when you consider that, you consider their response, because the question becomes, how is it that this festival can reconcile its shallow commitment to First Nations solidarity here because of that, while legitimizing and normalizing its relations with a settler colonial apartheid state that we know maintains a system of subjugation and land theft against Palestinians? So ultimately, and very, very disappointingly, Sydney Festival has created a culturally unsafe space for Palestinians, for artists, for the organizations that have worked really hard to be a part of this festival, to showcase their art at a time when, we're just 2 years in the middle of a pandemic, obviously have taken a massive hit, arts being defunded as well. So people are struggling. This is a really painful position to be in. And now, for people who have to choose between standing against racism and colonialism or, being complicit, and taking a hit to that, I think that the festival has really put us in a very untenable situation. So I guess ultimately where we're at right now is that artists have been pulling out, withdrawing, standing in solidarity, which has been amazing. And of course, as always, led by First Nations artists and performers and journalists and so on. And we've seen every day since this campaign went public, and we put out the public the statement, the public letter, and we called on artists to stand in solidarity. We've received massive support, which has been really heartening to see. And at this point, the festival, I guess, is scrambling to deal with the fact that all these incredible artists, that they've lost them.
So just a question, that 20,000, what percentage of the funding for Sydney Festival does that represent, would you estimate?
0.1. We didn't estimate, we did math.
Zero.
Unless I'm missing 0.01 or 0.1, yes. But yeah, it is minuscule compared to the massive budget that Sydney Festival has. So we both know that this is more than just the money.
So for 0.1% of their budget, how many artists have pulled out? Because I've heard that it's around 30. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. 30 and counting. And don't forget that there are some who have pulled out. So productions that count as one production, but of course encompass many, many artists, production crew and team and everybody behind it. So yeah, there are a lot of people being impacted by this at the moment.
And what percentage is that, roughly, of the performers in the entire festival?
I think we're up to about 15% right now, 10 to 15. Thank God we did this today, just because we were curious to do the math.
Well, out of the 118 events, the way that they've divided it up is quite confusing. But so we've had 30 acts essentially, that are doing, several shows, several events. So 30 of the 118 is close to 25%.
Wow. So at this point, we have 25% approaching 30% of the acts pulling out for what is 0.1% of the funding for the festival. Now, this will be worrying and concerning the very same people that were concerned by Jennine working in a mainstream media institution. What has the response been? Not only, I've seen that David Kirk from Sydney Festival has issued a statement. What has the response of Sydney Festival been, and what has been the response of wider media circles been to this?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the Sydney Festival is actually playing it quite sort of using the freedom of speech argument, that creatives have a right to express themselves, and that they don't really take a position on this, which is again ironic given that, as I mentioned to you before, you can't say that you're apolitical or non-political on stolen land, nor can you say that when you're a festival like this that represents or that is about building space, a community with so many of these different artists and all that they represent and their work represents. So it is most certainly selective. I think at this
partnering
point
with the Israeli embassy in and of itself is political. It's political. So it's been it's a cop-out by them.
Absolutely. I don't know if you read this, but disappointingly, Kirk was actually involved in the campaign to boycott South Africa during the apartheid regime, because he was a captain, I think, or a player on the football team. Not a sports person, but I think it was. Is it the All Blacks? I think it was.
The All Blacks New Zealand team, New Zealand rugby union team. In 1986, they there was a tour that was taking place in apartheid South Africa, and he and one other player out of I guess 30 at the time boycotted and said they wouldn't go, and so he took a moral stance, and he did the right thing in 1986. Fast forward to 2022, what happened? It's interesting. We talk about the numbers, and it's something that we organizers keep coming back to over and over and over again. And the question is why? Why did Sydney Festival seek out the Israeli embassy's funding? In May 2021, mind you, last year, during the peak of the massacre, the onslaught of Gaza, while we watched buildings being decimated and Palestinians being murdered in real time, while Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in Salwan, were being forcibly removed from their homes, when we were all watching collectively, the world, a settler from New Jersey, saying to Mona al-Gurd, if I don't steal your home, somebody else is going to steal it. Why, in the midst of that, and beyond that, we were campaigning here too during that time, right? Because the media coverage was appalling. So there was definitely an awareness, especially by some of the members on the board, who I might add signed the open letter asking the media to do better on Palestine at that time. Yet the board sought and approached the embassy and made this partnership happen. And, it's not just a partnership. They are a star sponsor. And if you take a look at the website and you look at the partnerships, you just have these local arts organizations, these local institutions, the state of New South Wales, and then Israel just sitting there, left of field. And so we know instinctively that there is something more happening here. What it is, we can't really pin down at the moment. We have our theories, but it's been deeply baffling as well. Many people have responded, in terms of the response by others. It's shocking to them as well, like $20,000, such a measly amount. And to be clear, if it was $1 billion, it still wouldn't be worth it. But it does raise more questions, because this is not monetary motivation. There isn't any sort of like financial motivation here. And in terms of the responses from the Zionist lobby groups and the usuals, I'll say, it has been the usual response, but I might add, interestingly, not to the same effect as we would have anticipated. And maybe we're just not like tuned in because we're, just like working overtime and speaking to artists and sort of being grounded in community and getting the word out there. But, I was speaking to Ido Conrad, who is the deputy editor at 972 Mag, and he made the observation to me that, it's interesting. I've been watching this from afar, and it seems that this time round, that sort of the accusations of sort of anti-Semitism haven't been coming up as often as, they always do. Which, and I don't have any conclusion, but these are some of the observations that have been made. Those accusations have been made. They were today by someone at the Anti-Defamation League or Anti-Defamation Commission, one of them. His name's Vir Abramovich. So he came out and said it was anti-Semitic. And the Israeli embassy put out a statement saying that that culture and cultural events do not belong in the political space, which is complete nonsense. But speaking of Vir, this is just a tangent, but just to give you some context here, Vir tried to sue me last year when I had called out the fact that he was going after Palestinian and Arab women who were speaking out on Palestine and contacting employers, and he also represents B'nai B'rith in some capacity, and they also were instrumental in lobbying my editors when I was working as a journalist at News Corp. So a lot of these things, it feels like it's a handful of people, right, that we're dealing with over the years. It's sort of the same, again, the usual suspects that we're dealing with. And we definitely anticipated them to respond in such a way. And let me know if I'm rambling and stop me at any time. But I think what I find quite interesting is that perhaps they are sort of trying to hit back at us in the same way that they normally do. But we haven't noticed because the support has been overwhelming. The general support from people, from artists, has just been so overwhelming, so positive, and not something I think we would have seen 1 year or 2 years ago. And I think it also comes off of the back of our campaign earlier last year during the onslaught on Gaza, where we organized an open letter calling on media outlets on this continent to do better on Palestine, because they were completely mum on Sheikh Jarrah, on what was happening in Gaza, until there was sort of something that they could chuck in there about Hamas. And I mean, the reporting was appalling, and it's something that we always expect and anticipate, and that we're used to. But enough was enough, I mean, at that point. And I think also living and being in a sort of an unprecedented time for us during a pandemic, it sort of makes you take stock of everything. And it was just we're isolated at home, and we're watching these videos of our people getting slaughtered. And yeah, so I mean, there have been quite a few actions, I think, that have led to this overwhelming support and have allowed people to also understand the situation better, truly, because it's so black and white, despite the hasbara that wants to convince us that it's grey. It's so black and white. And I wanted to add that the Sunday paper was also launched, led by three artists who are non-Indigenous, non-Palestinian, but collaborated with First Nations and Palestinians here. It was sort of an idea we all sort of put to each other in protest of Schwartz Media, which has also, it's a progressive except for Palestine outlet. It's the only sort of progressive publisher here on this continent, aside from, say, The Guardian. And they have, and this is again in John Lyons' book, they have an unwritten policy that you do not touch Palestine. You do not critique Israel. And this also came to the fore in statements and anecdotes in John Lyons' book as well. So I think people have also, just hearing these stories, having these sorts of things exposed, including my experience as a young journalist, seeing how far the Zionist lobbyists and the state of Israel will go to silence people, I think has truly shocked people, and has also led, I suppose, to what we're seeing now.
So I'm one of the people that has signed this fantastic statement for creatives regarding the Sydney Festival and this important boycott. If you could just break down for us, what is this statement? Who has signed it already? And who do we want to sign it going forward?
So the open letter is a letter for artists, creatives, producers from across the industry, not necessarily programmed in the Sydney Festival, but those who stand in solidarity with Palestine and the pursuit of liberation for Palestine, and against the Sydney Festival's decision to maintain its partnership and star sponsorship with the Israeli embassy using Israeli state money. So we've had over 1,000 artists and creatives, including high-profile actors like British actress Miriam Margolyes has signed the open letter calling on the Sydney Festival to drop this partnership. We've had the Palestinian actors Saleh Bakri, Adam Bakri, Mahmoud Bakri, Slimane Mansour, who is an incredible contemporary, Palestinian painter, has signed the open letter, along with many other brilliant creatives across the world, from Palestine to the UK, Europe, the US, and also locally, and many First Nations artists here as well. So essentially, the open letter includes the names of the individuals and also organizations that are calling on the Sydney Festival to drop the partnership. And so it's another way for us to let Sydney Festival know that artists and creatives, in particular, those within the arts industry, condemn this partnership. So yeah, we've been working on sort of a few different fronts, and the open letter is sort of a big part of it. And it also sits on the same website as the open letter to media outlets that went live last year during the onslaught on Gaza, which was signed by journalists and reporters and media workers in the Australian media landscape as well. And that received over 700 signatures, right, from people working at the different public broadcasters and the different media outlets. And so for people within these industries to call out these institutions that are doing wrong by Palestinians, I think is really powerful and really helped sort of set the momentum for the withdrawal of artists.
I want to add as well that I think what the letter does, it really makes clear and highlights to those that are signing who might not necessarily be familiar, in addition to just reinforcing the fact of what we know, is that Israel has, long used culture and the arts to, as we call it, art wash, to cloak its atrocities and legitimize and normalize them against us as a peoples. And so for us Palestinians, we understand that the freedom, to express, to perform, to create art is suppressed daily by the Israeli regime and its machinery. And Jennine illustrated that earlier this evening as a journalist and as a writer, that how she was subjected to this sort of systemic, concentrated silencing of Palestinians wherever we are, wherever we may have a role that represents just a tiny bit of power representation. So I think it's quite laughable that in the same breath as claiming to say, they care about the arts and they care about promoting culture, and that, culture has no space in the political arena, which is what the Israeli embassy, spokesperson said in response to our boycott, that culture and politics don't go. In the same breath as saying that, they continue to target us and as artists, as creatives, and dispossess and punish artists and poets like Darin Tatur, like Mohammed Al-Kurd, who actually signed our statement as well, and cartoonist Hafiz Omar, all of them for daring to speak out against the apartheid regime. So I think, we we are very familiar with the sort of the catalog of abuses, which you've already outlined, and we know everything from the home demolitions to the theft to the torture. I think, but what is often sometimes not as explicit or as detailed is the fact that Israeli forces attack cultural institutions. They disrupt our events, they destroy our archives, they co-opt, and they're, explicitly involved in cultural appropriation, which is why it was amazing to see Tatris celebrated and honored as a Palestinian art just a few weeks ago. So I think the fact that the state of Israel prevents us from pursuing our right to artistic and cultural expression and subjects us to this sort of material, symbolic form of violence is something that people need to understand is exactly why, we are raising this concern, as part of the festival and asking people to boycott in solidarity, artist to artist in this sphere, because ultimately, if I'm not safe, if we're not safe, none of us are safe.
Yeah, and the key to the situation is as follows. We do not exceptionalize Israel. Israel is exceptionalized by the international community. It continually violates human rights and breaks international humanitarian law, but never finds itself subject to sanction. In fact, quite the opposite. You look at the core of this issue is Article 11 of UN Resolution 194, the right of Palestinians to return. Today, we are in a situation where 1 in 3 refugees in the world are Palestinian. And by Israel preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes, they are going against the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Israel acquires land by force. That is illegal according to international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. You cannot move and transfer non-indigenous populations from one area to the area that you occupy. That is a violation of the 4th Geneva Conventions. Paragraph 6, Article 49. Israel violates the right of the child by detaining approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children annually, some as young as 12. And the most common charge that they receive is for stone throwing, for which the maximum sentence is 20 years. And today, with the IDF's new legislation, essentially a license to kill, to shoot with live ammunition. Israel also has a formal system of legalized discrimination against Palestinians, which fits the official definition within the United Nations of apartheid, which we all know is known and considered to be a crime against humanity and is rejected by the majority of humanity. It has a dual legal system, which, according to Article 43 of the Fourth Hague Convention, is also illegal. The International Court of Justice published its opinion in 2004 that the apartheid wall in the West Bank that Israel has built with Elbit Systems and other parasitic companies is illegal and should be dismantled. Yet here we are, 18 years later, and you still have that illegal wall standing. We also know that according to the Geneva Conventions, the targeting of civilians is a crime. Israel continually does that. Collective punishment is also a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Yet we see still standing the siege of Gaza that Israel enforces, widely recognized, even by those in the British government, as a form of collective punishment. In 2020, there were 17 different UN General Assembly resolutions criticizing Israel. Now, when we just need to get an idea of that figure, overall, there were 23 different resolutions criticizing states. Out of those 23, 17 of them criticized the state of Israel. That's the reason for an organization like UN Watch existing. But what that clearly shows is that this state is outside of what the international community consider the norm of behavior. Yet there are no consequences. Israel refuses to define its own borders and has invaded every single country and occupied every single country that it is next to. Israel is believed to have carried out assassinations in at least 18 different states, from Italy to France to Cyprus to Greece to Norway to Germany, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Uruguay, Lebanon, Brazil, Tunisia, Belgium, Malta, Malaysia, Syria, and Iran. Is Israel punished for that? No, it is not. Does it face sanction? No, it does not. In fact, worse than that, the United States gives $10.4 million a day, $430,000 an hour, $7,000 a minute, and $120 per second of US taxpayers' money to racist, Israeli, supremacist apartheid in Palestine. And on top of that, you had recently US Congress vote to give another $1 billion to Israel on top of that in order to replenish its Iron Dome system, which essentially means a transfer of funds from the US taxpayer to US arms company Raytheon and Israeli arms company Rafael to replenish that Iron Dome system. In 2020, pro-Israel lobby groups and individuals gave over $33 million to members of US Congress. That is the relationship which buttresses what we are talking about. So the message must be absolutely clear to the Israeli embassy in Australia, to Danny Danon, to all of those within the Israeli government who want to turn around and say Emma Watson is somehow driven by an irrational hatred of people, that Sally Rooney is somehow driven by an irrational hatred of people, that the 30 different acts that are pulling out of the Sydney Festival are somehow motivated by an irrational hatred of people. No, it's the opposite. We are motivated by a love of humanity and a love of people. And despite all of the money that you invest in misleading people, in lying to people, in subverting people, we will continue to push and make your project more and more difficult by the day. And people know the truth about what Israel does. And we have to understand that we are part of the permanent war. We are also targets too. As Jennine's experience has clearly articulated, there are boundaries and limitations placed upon what we can and cannot do. And this momentous campaign is a middle finger in the face of the Israeli embassy in Australia and Israeli embassies everywhere across the planet. Thank you so much for joining us today. And may there be more and more campaigns like the boycott campaign against the Sydney Festival. A message to David Kirk, a message to those on the board of Sydney Festival. When you take this money, you are inviting a PR disaster for what you do. We will not back down, no retreat, no surrender. Thank you very much for joining us today on The Watchdog. See you again soon.